A house on a quiet street is drowning in darkness, and in the living room there is blood. A lot of blood. And in the middle of this scene is a young mother who has just lost her two own sons. There are deep cuts on her neck, lacerations on her arms. Just minutes earlier, she herself called emergency services and told the dispatcher in a broken voice that a stranger had broken into the house, an unknown person, an intruder. But the scene of the incident looks strange. The traces don't add up to one clear picture. The details seem to argue with each other. A little later, not far from the house, a small object will be found. At first glance, a trifle, almost unremarkable, and at the same time, perhaps the key piece. There is a special category of cases that don't let you go, the very ones you return to again and again, replaying the same thought in your head. What really happened there? Cases where the facts stubbornly refuse to add up to one understandable explanation. Stories that strike you with their cruelty and icy calculation. Stories where it doesn't fit in your head how a living person could bring themselves to do something like this. Where the details contradict each other, the narrator's intonation argues with the evidence, where the nighttime silence turns out to be louder than any scream. Today's story belongs to exactly this category of cases. A woman named Darlie. It begins with an emergency call in the dead of night and with a crime scene that to this day is described as both chaotic and carefully staged. But what really happened there? The heroine of this story was born on January 4, 1970, in the small town of Altoona, Pennsylvania, a quiet place with an abundance of greenery, nature, and wide, peaceful views, a setting in which it seems you are protected, where children grow up without suspecting what paths life will one day lead them down. Later, Darlie, together with her mother and stepfather, moves to the state of Texas. And Texas is not just a dot on the map. It is a particular state of mind. Cowboy hats, cows, horses, lassos, long straight highways disappearing into the horizon, and a sense of absolute freedom. And at a certain point, Darlie herself ends up in this establishment, either helping out or just stopping by to visit her mother, and there she sees him for the first time, Darren. He is 17, a couple of years older, a calm guy without bravado or showy swagger. The kind who quietly gets down to business and helps out where needed. And she is blonde, noticeably beautiful, cheerful, and a self-confident young woman who fully understands that people see her. Between them, that very spark immediately flares up. Something like love at first sight. That same day, they go on their first date, and from that moment on, they become inseparable. It's that familiar feeling, the first stage of falling in love. Butterflies inside, a slight tremor, a mix of excitement and anxiety. The sense that you've finally arrived where you're meant to be, even though everything is just beginning. Looking to the future. The first fever of emotions grows into a real, conscious attachment. In 1988, a little more than 3 years after they met, Darlie and Darren exchange vows. They get married and promise each other a long, happy life together. A young couple full of dreams, firmly convinced of the formula, the two of us against the world. A business, a company specializing in testing technical equipment. The business is doing well, genuinely well. Revenues are climbing, the money is coming in steadily, and along with their success, their standard of living rises too. The couple buys a house in a quiet suburb, spacious, well-kept, fully matching the image of the classic American dream. A manicured lawn out front, familiar neighbors on the street, a sense of safety. They begin building a family. The couple has 3 sons, Devin, Damon, and Drake. They turn into a real big family. There's an amusing detail in this story. All the names in the house start with D. Darlie, Darren, Devin, Damon, Drake. It's not hard to imagine the confusion that sometimes arose when someone was called from the next room. Try figuring out who exactly was being addressed at that moment. From the outside, it seems like everything in this family is working out perfectly. A family you could put on a postcard. Darlie is described as a loving, caring mother, a woman who bakes, cooks, looks after her sons, and literally lives for them. She's supportive of her neighbors, helps out if someone is sick or in trouble. It's even known that the couple once gave financial help to a friend who had been diagnosed with cancer. In other words, at first glance, they're not just a striking picture. They really do seem like genuinely kind people. And all of this against a backdrop of obvious prosperity. A big house, a business, sons, expensive jewelry. Darlie gets cosmetic surgery on her chest and wears flashy diamond rings. She enjoys her well-being and doesn't hesitate to show it off. The American dream in its purest form. By every appearance, it's the perfect family portrait, and only one detail in it has been off from the very beginning. In '96, the family business starts to stall. Orders become fewer, the flow of clients thins out, and the fixed expenses don't go anywhere. Debts pile up month after month, financial pressure grows, and the lifestyle they had grown accustomed to, the one that until recently seemed like something taken for granted, turns out to be simply unaffordable. Tens of thousands of dollars in debt accumulate on credit cards, and even the mortgage on the house, the very one that just yesterday was a symbol of success, is now in jeopardy. On the outside, however, almost nothing changes. No sharp cutbacks, no visible attempts to tighten the belt, no conversations about needing to rethink habits. Life carries on as before. Vacations, purchases, status symbols, the same ostentatious ease in spending. According to available information, Darlie, during precisely this period, is planning a trip to Cancun with her friends. It's a Mexican resort on the shore of the Caribbean Sea. The place is far from cheap, and such a trip costs quite serious money. And here a natural question arises. Why is she doing this at a moment when she's drowning in debt? Is it ordinary denial, stubborn optimism in the spirit of, quote, one, or that very pressure that forces you at any cost to maintain the image of a successful family and keep telling everyone around you the beautiful story of a perfect life, so that no one would suspect that inside everything is already bursting at the seams? It's important to understand that financial problems are the kind of thing that can eat away at a person from within almost imperceptibly, especially when there are 3 young children in the house. A stack of unpaid bills piles up on the kitchen table, and the family business no longer brings in anything close to what it used to. And on the outside, there's still the radiant, perfect family, that very picture postcard image. But inside, behind closed doors, the picture may be entirely different. Sleepless nights when you lie there and count in your head how to pay the bills next month. So far, nothing critical. So far, it's just a family caught in financial trouble, the kind of which there are thousands and thousands across the country. But sometimes it's precisely from stories like these that truly monstrous things grow. Not from any single moment, not from one breakdown, but from slowly mounting pressure. And the question here is only one. How much longer will this carefully constructed facade hold before it finally cracks and lays bare what has been hidden inside for years? And so, on June 6, 1996, at 2:31 in the morning, a quiet suburban neighborhood, an ordinary single-family detached home. Thousands of them stand across America along identical streets. A call comes into the emergency dispatch service. On the other end of the line is a woman who can barely keep it together. Her breathing is broken, pure panic in her voice, words running into one another. She's screaming into the phone, begging the operator not to hang up, saying she needs help, that her children are wounded, that someone needs to be sent immediately. The caller is that same Darlie. While she continues speaking with the dispatcher, the first police officers pull up to the house. One of the investigators later recalled this moment in full detail. According to him, the moment he stopped his car in front of the house, a man came running out the front door. The officer shouted at him to stop so he could see who was in front of him and what exactly was going on. It turned out to be Darren, Darlie's husband. When asked what he was doing outside in the dead of night, Darren replied that he lived in this house and was about to run across the street to call the neighbor, who was a nurse. What exactly was happening at that very second at the front door, and why Darren was in such a panic, and whether he was really running for the nurse, or whether he had some other reason to be at the entrance in the very midst of this nighttime nightmare. When the officer finally enters the house, Darlie is still holding the receiver and talking to the operator. And what the officer sees next, by all accounts, he will never forget. However, the rest of his life unfolds. In the living room, right on the floor, lie the two youngest. The investigator himself later described the scene like this. He saw two sons of the homeowners on the living room floor. With one of them, it was immediately clear that nothing could be done to help. The second was still moving. Darlie, meanwhile, was standing a few meters away from her own sons and continued talking on the phone. The two older boys, Devin and Damon, had apparently been attacked with a sharp object. Multiple puncture wounds were found on them. By the time the police arrived, the older one, 6-year-old Devin, was no longer showing any signs of life. His injuries were not survivable. The second, 5-year-old Damon, was still weakly moving, still trying to fight for every breath. He would never forget the youngest boy until the end of his days. Damon was looking at the officers with wide-open eyes, coughing up evidence of severe internal injuries, and in his gaze you could read genuine conscious fear. According to the officer, Damon seemed to understand that he was slipping away, and that awareness was visible in the expression on his face. When Darren, the father, comes back into the house, the investigator asks him to help save Damon. The officer, meanwhile, does not take his eyes off him for a single second, and looks at him now not as a colleague in misfortune, but as someone who must assess what is happening from the outside. Is the father truly trying to help his own? Or is there something strange in his behavior, something that doesn't add up with the typical reaction of a parent in such a horrific situation? The television was on in the living room well into the night. The two older boys had dozed off downstairs next to their mother, and it was on this very evening that everything would begin. At that moment, she looked toward her husband to see if he was helping. Darlie, meanwhile, was performing CPR. The parents were desperately trying to save the youngest of the sons, but the wounds were too severe, and within mere minutes after the older brother, Damon was gone too. In just moments, the family loses two sons at once. Darlie herself is also seriously injured. There are numerous cuts and bruises on her body. There are marks on her arms, and in addition, a blade had been drawn across her throat. The necklace she wore around her neck had been pressed so deeply into the tissue by the blow that it would later have to be surgically removed. Darlie is taken to the hospital and she survives, but as doctors will later say, it came down to literally a millimeter. She herself would later describe it this way: the throat was cut from one edge to the other. Darlie stated that the carotid artery had been nicked but not severed all the way through. A couple of millimeters deeper, which is essentially almost nothing, and she would have bled out within minutes. And there would have been no continuation to this story. 2 millimeters between life and what could have happened. Next, Darlie would claim that an outsider had entered the home, a strange man. During the attack, why didn't anyone hear anything? The two youngest who can never be brought back, a mother who claims she fought for her life, and a crime scene that would very soon raise more questions than provide answers. Darlie herself describes the beginning of that day as completely ordinary, an unremarkable evening. The television in the living room, the two older sons together with her had dozed off on the first floor in front of the screen, and the youngest ones that night were sleeping upstairs. And so everything looked familiar, mundane, calm, a family that, after a long day, simply shuts down from exhaustion. And then, according to her, something happened. Darlie says that Damon woke her up. The older boys were dozing downstairs next to her, and the next thing, what she remembers, Damon is sitting on her shoulder. He's pressing on her shoulder with his hand and calling out, "Mama, mama, mama." Who would be the mother? And when she opens her eyes, she allegedly sees a man walking away toward the kitchen. A stranger in your home in the middle of the night. A feeling that's hard to even imagine for someone who has never experienced it. It's enough to recall how you sometimes flinch at a rustle in your own apartment, mistaking the silhouette of a loved one for a shadow, and you realize that even a familiar figure in the darkness can frighten you to the core. When a relative is staying over, and at the sight of a silhouette in the hallway, your heart literally drops to your feet. And yet, it's just your own person there. So how must it feel to realize that before you stands a true stranger, an uninvited intruder, ready for anything? According to Darlie, he was wearing a baseball cap on his head. She couldn't make out his face, only the silhouette, only the movement toward the kitchen. And on top of that, she allegedly heard the sound of breaking glass, a window that the man who broke into the house had smashed. Then, according to her version, she got up and went after this unknown person, first to the kitchen, then from the utility room into the garage. She rises. Damon walks beside her, and when she reaches the corner of the kitchen, she manages to see how the man passes through the utility area and exits into the garage. From a common-sense perspective, such behavior looks strange. Why would you follow a person who has just attacked your family? Although you have to understand, in a situation like this, when a wave of adrenaline is coursing through your body, few people are capable of soberly assessing what they are actually doing. In such a state, a person acts on pure instinct, and predicting your own reaction in advance is impossible. Darley's version, in any case, is laid out clearly. A stranger entered the house. He passed through the kitchen and disappeared through the garage. The only question is this: does her account match what investigators would later discover at the scene, or is this picture missing one decisive detail? And so, immediately after the incident, detectives get to work. Step by step, they begin to reconstruct the events of that night, examining the house literally millimeter by millimeter. Any crime scene is a puzzle. Every trace, every hair, every drop can carry significance. Together, they tell part of the story, and sometimes the setting of a room speaks more truth than the people themselves who describe it. An experienced investigator knows that a house after such a tragedy becomes a kind of silent witness that cannot lie. Splatter patterns follow their own laws of physics, furniture shifts the way it shifts, and objects end up exactly where the events placed them, not where someone's fabricated version claims. When examining the house, detectives initially come across details that seem to support Darley's version. In the garage, they discover a cut window screen, a potential point of entry for an outsider. A kitchen knife is found inside the home, which would later be identified as a possible weapon. This knife came from the family's household set kept in the kitchen. According to the investigators' theory, a second one had also been used, but it vanishes without a trace. Up to this point, the picture shows signs of a desperate struggle, with evidence found on virtually every surface. Pieces of a wine glass on the floor, a vase of flowers knocked over in the living room, evidence on the carpet, evidence in the kitchen. There seem to be traces on nearly every other object. At first glance, all of this looks like the aftermath of a chaotic struggle, as if someone had been smashing everything in reach. And it's from precisely this point that the investigators' work begins, to search for the truth within it. Evidence doesn't lie, but it can easily be misinterpreted, and there's something almost mesmerizing about this. The house seems to come alive and begin speaking to those who arrived. It literally tells the story of what happened here. You just have to listen carefully. The first doubts about Darley's version arise right at the doorstep. One of the investigators working that night would later recall the moment he walked into the living room. The paramedics are still fighting for her son's life. Everything is happening at the limit, and in that very minute, Darley asks a question. She isn't asking about the child or about the attacker. She's asking about her jewelry. The mistress of the house stands at the bar counter between the kitchen and living room, outwardly detached, as if all of this were happening to someone else. Essentially, the impression forms that her thoughts aren't on her youngest son or his brother. They're on what's lying on the counter. She wants to know whether anything is missing, whether the intruder made off with her jewelry. And in that very moment, one of her sons is already beyond saving, while the other is still clinging to life. Why ask about trinkets? Shock, confusion, an attempt to grab hold of something familiar. And immediately the next detail jumps out. The jewelry is right where it was, despite the alleged break-in. It continues to lie out in the open, untouched, right on the counter. Why would a burglar break into a home and not take the most valuable items lying in plain sight? Why would he leave behind the very baubles he supposedly came for? This is just the beginning of the inconsistencies. Right there on the scene, Darley herself tells the investigators something remarkable. According to her, she had touched the weapon, the same butcher knife that had been used to inflict wounds on her sons. She picked it up and wiped off the fingerprints, a convenient explanation in case her prints did turn up on the blade. But here too, a counter-question arises. Why would a victim touch the weapon at all? Why wipe possible fingerprints off it if you yourself are the victim? Confusion, an impulse, or an attempt to provide an explanation in advance before uncomfortable questions are asked. And then there's that broken wine glass. It's lying on the floor, shards scattered across the tile. But when investigators look more closely, they notice something strange. Beneath the shards is blood. Further analysis will reveal that this blood belongs to Darlie herself, meaning the blood ended up there before the glass was broken. Yet, in her account, everything is different. She claims she only heard the sound of breaking glass while she was still asleep at that moment. The attack. Next, the kitchen. Against the wall stands a black vacuum cleaner, and it's literally covered in blood. Not a couple of random drops. Blood on the body, on the handle, on the floor beneath it. It looks as if someone grabbed the vacuum with bloodied hands, moved it, repositioned it. Even more telling, beneath it, investigators find bloody tracks from the rolling wheels and the impression of a foot. Lab analyses will later confirm that both the blood and the print belong to Darlie. Why move a vacuum cleaner in the middle of an attack scene? To wipe something away? To hide something? To stage something? In parallel, they examine the nightgown Darlie was wearing that night. On the back are bloodstains and tiny spatter droplets, which will later be linked to the moments of the strikes. One of the investigators puts it this way: only the upward and downward motion of a weapon could have created such a pattern on top of the fabric. On the front of the same gown, they also find spatter, and while the larger smears could be explained by the mother attempting to help her sons, these tiny droplets cannot. They form in a completely different way. And finally, that supposed point of entry of the intruder, the cut window screen in the garage. Upon careful inspection, investigators are met with a surprise. On one of the kitchen knives with a rounded tip, they find fibers from that very screen. And this opens up an entirely new chain of questions. If the intruder was supposed to first cut through the screen to get into the house, how did he manage to use a knife for that which was lying in the kitchen? It turns out he would have had to first somehow get inside, take the bread knife from there, return to the window, cut the screen, then go back, put the knife in the holder, and only after that grab a different knife to attack the lady of the house and her sons. Essentially, it sounds, to put it mildly, absurd, and one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence isn't in the house at all. It will be found about 69 meters away from it, in the nearest alley. It's a bloodied sock. Analysis will show that the blood on it belongs to both of the deceased, Damon and Devon. Later, one detail would emerge in the case that sounded particularly strange. A sock. An ordinary child's sock found right by the storm drain grate. And the question that immediately comes to mind, how did it end up there? Maybe it was dropped by the person Darlie described as the attacker while he was fleeing. Or maybe someone left it there on purpose. The item. This sock would have the blood of both sons on it. And here's what's truly troubling. The sock was lying by the grate out in the open, in plain sight, as if whoever threw it there wanted the find to be noticed. Evidence isn't hidden like that. According to the investigation's theory, if a person is really trying to cover their tracks, they toss things into a trash can somewhere in the yard or drop them straight down into the sewer, not leave them in a visible spot as if signed, "Look here, find me." And that's exactly how it looked. The sock was lying out in the open, as if intentionally. And here a simple question arises. Why would anyone do that? Beyond that, investigators still had another layer to consider. Blood and DNA analysis from the scene. This data could either confirm the picture Darlie was describing or completely overturn it and introduce new mysteries. First, the blood. According to her, she chased the attacker through the entire house, but the pattern of the droplets told a different story. The movement was calm, measured, without any commotion or running. Moreover, she claimed she chased him all the way to the garage, but in the garage they didn't find a single drop. How is that possible? A person is losing blood throughout the house, and then, upon reaching the garage, suddenly stops dropping it. Darlie said the attack happened while she was lying on the couch, but there were no traces of blood on the couch itself. Instead, they were found by the kitchen sink. Someone had been washing up there, trying to clean something off. Next came the turn of the DNA analysis, and its result turned out to be extremely unambiguous. All the DNA traces collected at the scene belonged to 3 people. There was no other DNA, no foreign fingerprints either. Only one print remained unidentified. For the investigators, the picture came together clearly. According to their theory, Darlie's account did not match reality, and she had staged the scene herself in order to shift suspicion onto a mythical stranger. One of the investigators would later put it this way. To him, it was obvious from the very beginning that her story wasn't true. Not even close. Nothing like the truth. 1 or 2 inconsistencies could have been written off as stress or being a bad mother, but the whole story as a whole didn't add up. And still, is it really that clear-cut? Most of the evidence pointed in one direction, but there were still questions that hadn't gone anywhere. If Darlie really had staged everything herself, then why did she inflict such serious wounds on herself? Her throat was cut literally within mere millimeters of the point past which no help would have been possible, a tiny gap between life and what could have gone otherwise. It's almost impossible to calculate something like that in advance. Who would take such a risk for the sake of staging? And most importantly, why would she do any of this at all? Carry out something like this with her own sons? Neighbors described Darlie as a caring, loving mother, a person who lived for her family, to do to her own sons what had happened. But then why did they find no foreign DNA in the house, no outside fingerprints, not a single convincing trace that anyone else had been in the apartment that night? Which of the 2 versions was closer to the truth? 12 days after that night, on June 18, 1996, Darlie, together with her husband Darren, is called to the station. A conversation and a few clarifying questions. But as the spouses step across the threshold of the police building, neither of them yet suspects that only one of them will walk back out. After the conversation, Darren leaves the station. Darlie does not. The police detain the 26-year-old mother. She is charged in connection with what happened to her sons. By this point, too many inconsistencies had piled up in her statements. For most people, the assistant district attorney would later put it simply, a real bloodbath had taken place in the house, and when something like that happens, the perpetrator almost always turns out to be one of those who were in the home. Darlie herself continues to stick to her version and, most importantly, insists on her innocence. She maintains that she did not lay a hand on her sons and has nothing to do with what happened to them. Just a few months later, a trial opens against her. And in this trial, there is one important detail. At the center of the prosecution is only what happened to Damon, because the second possible weapon was never found. The autopsy showed that the butcher knife discovered at the scene, by all appearances, could have inflicted wounds on only one of the sons. And here's the catch. On that knife, they found exclusively Damon's blood. There were no traces of Devon's blood on the blade. That is precisely why Darlie was charged in only one episode. On January 6th, the court hears the opening statements from both sides. And over the entire trial hangs one single question, heavy and uncomfortable. Is a mother capable of raising a hand against her own sons? The prosecution doesn't doubt it for a second. According to her version, no outsider was in the house that night, no intruder who had broken in from outside. Darlie herself was inside, and it was she who took the situation to that fatal stage. And then, as the prosecution maintains, she tried to stage everything to look as though someone had actually broken into the house. She cut the screen mesh in the garage with a bread knife, then ran outside, walked about 69 meters down the alley, and left a bloodied sock there. A small piece of physical evidence that was meant to play its role and look like the trail of a fleeing attacker. After that, according to the prosecutor's logic, she returned to the house and inflicted injuries on herself, including a cut to her own throat. The final harsh stroke, intended to complete the picture of an outside attack, and only then the call to emergency services. A staging, a pre-planned scenario, That's how the prosecution sees it, and during the trial, the prosecution lays out a long list of evidence, among them the testimony of a forensic expert who confirms the role of the bread knife and backs up the conclusions. But in the courtroom, two more things come to light that will play no lesser role. The first is a diary entry. According to the investigation, Darlie made it just a few weeks before the tragedy. May 3rd. The text reads as follows: "Under no circumstances think that this is your fault." For the prosecutor, everything is perfectly transparent. In his words, she had certain thoughts. The defense sees it differently. The court barely takes into account that shortly before this, Darlie had given birth to her third son and was suffering from postpartum depression, a condition capable of crushing a woman from within. And the question arises, can one conclude from a short diary line that before us is a person ready to raise a hand against her own sons? Isn't it the case that a moment of despair and the most intimate thoughts are turned into something far louder than they actually were? And then the prosecution presents one more piece of evidence that will overturn the perception of the trial: a video recording. On it, Darlie and her family are filmed at her son's grave just 8 days after the tragedy. In the footage, she is smiling, singing happy birthday, because on that day it would have been Devon's birthday, and she sprays onto the grave so-called silly string, a can with a colored stream, the kind usually taken to parties. One of those present in the courtroom would later recall, "You could see that many on the jury reacted in exactly the same way. They couldn't believe their eyes. They were literally thrown off balance." For the prosecution, this recording becomes one of the key moments. A grieving mother does not behave like that. A counter-question arises: what does grief even look like? Doesn't everyone have the right to experience it in their own way? In the heat of the trial, Darlie makes a risky decision. Against the advice of her own attorneys, she agrees to testify. But during cross-examination, the prosecutor steadily ratchets up the pressure, and at some point, she breaks down. Darlie claims she has amnesia, sudden memory loss, gaps in her recollection. The prosecutor is in no rush to believe this. According to him, she claims to have memory lapses. But this amnesia is awfully convenient. The moment she's confronted with another inconvenient piece of evidence, she immediately produces a new version of events. The defense throws everything it has into the fight. The attorneys try to undermine the evidence. There are no witnesses, no confession, no motive. Darlie's attorney emphasizes that she had not the slightest reason to harm her own children. Beyond the traces and contradictions, any case like this comes down to motive. And this is where the prosecution's moment to shine arrives. They paint for the court the image of a woman spoiled and pushed to the edge because her husband's business wasn't bringing in enough money to cover the bills. According to this picture, Darlie, struggling with depression and at the same time convinced of her own exceptional nature, Darlie is guilty of a crime against her 5-year-old son Damon. The maximum penalty, capital, lethal injection. A sentence intended to end her life, because over these 8 hours, not only the question of her guilt is being decided, but also the question of her very existence. The walls of a tiny cell on death row, and the awareness that one day the state may decide to put an end to her life. And at that very moment, there are people sitting in the courtroom. The verdict has been delivered, the period has been placed, and that is precisely when the discussion around the case truly flares up. And first and foremost, around Darren. Within a matter of days, a man has lost literally everything, both sons and now his wife as well. Legally, the story is closed, but beyond the courtroom there remain many people who do not believe in Darlie's guilt and are convinced that somewhere either the investigation or the jurors made a major mistake. Loudest of all in this chorus is her own family. For those close to her, the very thought that Darlie could have raised a hand against her own sons, Darren does not turn away from Darlie, does not cross her out of his life. Once every 3 weeks he travels to visit her, not missing a single visit, and publicly remains on her side. For him, the picture of that night has never changed. A stranger broke into the house, took the lives of his sons, and left her bleeding out. He still lives with this version to this day. Holes in the prosecution's claims are no less serious. According to him, his wife was convicted not on evidence, but on reputation. At trial, they molded her into a monster, latching onto every little detail from videos to photographs. If you judged anyone in the country that way, he says, almost everyone would turn out to be guilty. In the defendant's chair, Darlie was called nearly every existing insult, and she, according to him, is not the person they portrayed on screen in that short clip. Since her relatives continue to believe in her innocence, they begin searching for someone capable of helping. The chain leads them to a Texas millionaire. This man had earlier taken it upon himself to support an inmate awaiting his fate on death row. And this time, he agrees to invest, hiring an attorney to comb through the entire case again from the very beginning. The defender almost immediately turns his attention in an unexpected direction. He looks where no one had really bothered to look before, at Darren himself. And the reason is quite specific. A life insurance policy had been taken out on Darlie, an amount of about $300,000. If she, too, had not survived that night, the husband would have received that entire sum, money that, logically, could have closed the accumulating debts and financial holes. Next, a document surfaces that raises even more questions. It is a sworn statement in which Darren admits that approximately 3 months before the tragedy, he was looking for someone supposedly willing to break into their home. The scenario sounded simple: stage a robbery in order to later collect an insurance payout. Here, the picture begins to come together differently, and if such a plan really did exist, it becomes clearer where the figure of the elusive intruder came from in the case in the first place. Darren himself categorically denies any connection to what happened to his sons. To clear himself of suspicion, he agrees to a polygraph examination. He fails the test. But even after that, no one essentially begins to dig into his direction seriously. Not the investigation, not the prosecution. A little later, an appellate attorney also joins the case, things that make your hair stand on end. The court stenographer, by his count, made over 30,000 errors in the official transcript, and roughly half of them are not typos, but substantive distortions. A simple question arises to which it is difficult to find an answer. How do you challenge a verdict if from the materials it is impossible to understand what exactly was said in the courtroom? Then more inconsistencies surface. The attorney discovers that the jurors were not shown the full recording, but only a short fragment. According to him, there was a 2-hour memorial ceremony before the silly string scene. And that's precisely what the jury never saw. The jurors only got the edited clip where Darlie is laughing and seems inappropriately cheerful. They never got the hours of footage where she's genuinely grieving. Then another oddity surfaces. Part of the photo documentation was hidden away. Around 1,000 photos had been taken, but the jury only had access to about 400 of them. Among the missing frames were shots showing Darlie's own injuries and bruising. The defense attorney insists that if the jury had seen these photographs, they might very well have developed doubts about whether a woman could inflict such injuries on herself alone. Other details feed into these doubts as well. First and foremost, the blood-stained sock. The defense calls it the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, and it all comes down to the timeline. An expert later explains that the son, who was still alive when paramedics arrived, couldn't have survived more than 9 minutes with those kinds of wounds. The call to emergency services lasted 5 minutes and 44 seconds, and throughout that entire time, Darlie never put down the receiver. When the ambulance crew finally arrived, they weren't allowed into the house for about 2 minutes. The officers were inspecting the perimeter first. If you add up all these intervals against the staging theory, Darlie herself is left with just over a minute, around 1 minute and 16 seconds. And in those seconds, according to the prosecution, she had to arrange the scene, run out of the house, carry the sock a distance of 49 meters, come back, and still find time to slash her own throat with a sharp object. Is it even realistic to fit something like that into such a time frame? The investigators themselves also come under fire. According to the defense, they grossly violated the most basic rules of working a scene. By the count, no fewer than 20 rescuers and officers passed through the house before the area was properly sealed off, which means any traces, prints, fibers, particles could have been smeared, displaced, or simply destroyed before the forensic team even got started. The bloodied towels remained lying exactly where they had fallen. Right beside them on the carpet, on top of the dried stains, were the shoe prints of the very people who were supposed to be documenting all of it. And it's from this point on that the picture of the scene stops being a picture and becomes something else entirely. The officers, as it later turned out, were moving evidence around themselves, stepping on stains, picking up individual items, rolling them up and putting them in the same bags that already held other things from the house. No sterility, no protocol, just the workflow of a night shift. And among the items the investigators touched was that very black vacuum cleaner, which for years had been considered nearly the main piece of evidence against Darlie. According to the prosecution's version, it was she who moved it in order to stage a false scene, an attack. Now it turns out it wasn't she who moved it. It was moved by those who came into the house afterward. And right here another question surfaces, one that essentially nullifies everything. Motive. Throughout her entire life, Darlie had not a single episode connected to aggression. Loved ones, acquaintances, neighbors, doctors, they all described her the same way: attentive, warm, caring. No outbursts of aggression, no complaints, no alarming calls from the past. And if you allow for the idea that she really did decide to rid herself of her own family, a strangeness arises. The youngest, the one who was less than a year old, was left untouched. He was the one who demanded her attention more than anyone. He was the reason she didn't sleep at night, the reason she fed, the reason she carried him in her arms. If, as the prosecution claims, the motive was exhaustion and a desire to shed the burden, the logic falls apart. She left alive the very one who was taking the most out of her. And the second strangeness, about money. According to the investigation's version, the story revolved around insurance. But the insurance was taken out not only on those she allegedly wanted to remove, it was also taken out on her husband, a large sum. If it was a matter of calculation, his disappearance would have brought far more. Yet he remained alive and unharmed. A cold, calculated plan isn't built that way. These questions hang in the air to this day. The attorneys return again and again to the violations committed during the trial. They point to the inconsistencies in the investigation's work, to shifted evidence, to the witness with the tire. The court refuses, time after time. Instead of a new hearing, Darlie receives a different offer, a deal. The conditions are simple. Regarding her sons, and then the highest measure of punishment is changed to life imprisonment, essentially a confession in exchange for a life. Darlie refuses, and here it's worth pausing. A person who has been sitting in the waiting block for nearly 30 years, who at any moment can have a date assigned, refuses to walk out of that cell. The condition is one, to say, quote, 3, she says, quote, 4, and that, quote, 5 has been ringing out for decades now. She wouldn't hold to her belief for so long if she were guilty. Almost 3 decades have passed since that night. The case has still not been closed. Darlie is still in the waiting block in Texas. Outside the window, the years pass by, and she doesn't know when it will all end for her. Her mother says she's prepared to do everything in her power until her dying day to prove her daughter's innocence. And Darlie herself admits in her letters that the love she receives from strangers all over the world is what helps her make it to the next morning. Sometimes a single minute here stretches out like a day, but the letters keep coming, and as long as they do, she has the strength to keep going. Isolation, routine, waiting for decisions, for answers, for a new trial that may never begin. In 2011, nearly 15 years after that night, Darren and Darlie divorce. She would later speak about it briefly. Too much had been taken from her, not only Drake and Devin and Damon. For the rest of her life, she now has to wonder what they would have become, how their voices would have changed, who they would have grown up to be. She maintains that she did nothing, and yet this was still taken from her, and that, in her words, is the greatest injustice of all. To this day, this case remains one of the most disputed in the history of Texas. It split people right down the middle. For some, everything is obvious. A selfish mother, a woman who loved jewelry, resorts, and vacations, a glittering lifestyle, took the shortest way out. She wanted the family to simply disappear so that the glamorous picture from before could return. For others, it's an entirely different woman, one who was never properly heard, who was written off based on her appearance, who suffered from postpartum depression according to the doctors, and who for all these 30 years has been repeating the same thing. I am not guilty. And in the end, the same two questions remain, the ones the entire story rests on. What really happened that night? Was it an outsider who entered the house from the outside, or did what unfolded within those walls grow from inside the family itself? Most likely no one will ever get the answers. But stories like this have another side, one that doesn't rest on detectives or attorneys or the court, but on the people who come to homes like this after everything is over. After the police have left, the experts have gone home, the cameras have gone dark, those who are left alone with what happened. One of these people is Thomas Kunt, a specialist from Germany. The profession listed in his documents sounds dry. Crime scene cleaner and disinfector. An expert on locations where the aftermath has been discovered. He himself puts it more briefly. Death is his life. It's a powerful way to put it, and the first question that arises is a simple one. How does someone even come to this kind of work? Was it a childhood dream? Thomas tells the story of his 11-year-old son. Recently, the boy told his mother that he wants to work just like his dad. His mother tried to gently talk him out of it. Mila, you'd have to clean up other people's belongings, the smells, the sights. Are you sure? And then the son clarified, No, I'm not talking about that. I want to stand on stage and make people laugh, just like Dad. So for the youngest member of the family, the father's profession is not what it actually is. He knows that Dad goes somewhere, does something, but without the details. The details haven't reached the nursery yet. Thomas himself, by his own admission, never dreamed of this particular line of work. He was always drawn to old things, things that carried their own history, a past, a previous owner. That's why he often ended up in places where apartments were being cleared out after the former residents had departed. People would call him and say roughly the same thing. Grandfather has passed on, there's a cabinet left. Want to take a look? And he would come. That's how he constantly found himself in this dimension. Wherever someone had departed, there could always be something of value. He calls it legendary. An evening with the grill, the usual company, nothing special. Among the guests was an officer from the Criminal Investigation Department. They got to talking, and at one point, the officer said something simple to Thomas. If you can calmly walk into homes and apartments where people have departed, if it doesn't throw you off balance, why not take this up seriously? Not the belongings, not the furniture, not the antiques, but the cleanup, after everything is over. And from that evening on, in essence, a different life would begin. Up to that moment, he had never faced a real challenge. The idea of cleaning crime scenes came to Thomas Sukund almost like a revelation. He reasoned this way. If you're the first to cross the threshold of an apartment after a tragedy, then you're the first to see what's hidden from outsiders' eyes. In essence, you're standing before a treasure no one has yet touched. And you alone have the chance to examine these. He spent the entire weekend on the internet and fairly quickly understood two things. First, there was no decent information about this profession in Germany. Second, no special education or certification was required. And as it would turn out later, such a training system simply didn't exist in the country. So he downloaded the simplest program for printing business cards, knocked out some cards in a hurry, and began sending out advertisements everywhere, wherever he could reach. In parallel, he kept working at his main position at the financial company. But he had to make a living somehow, and his new venture was only bringing in expenses so far. Time passed, and there was no response. Then, at some point, the phone rang in the office. The secretary picked up. On the other end of the line, the caller clearly identified himself. Criminal Investigation Division, Serious Crimes Unit, Commissioner Wheezy speaking. Mr. Kunt is needed urgently. None of his colleagues even suspected that Thomas was involved in crime scene cleanup. And what cleanup could there be when he hadn't been on a single call yet? The secretary walked into his office with trembling hands and silently held out the phone. Her voice was shaking when she told him that the Criminal Investigation Department was on the line. Thomas picked up the receiver, and in that moment he himself had almost managed to forget that he'd even signed up for this venture. Business cards. The commissioner got straight to the point. "You're the one who handles crime scene cleanup. Firearm residue, biological evidence, brain matter. You work with all of that?" Thomas confirmed on autopilot. "Of course. All familiar territory, no problem at all." They quickly dictated the address to him. He needed to head out immediately, and then they hung up. He stood there with the phone in his hand, his head pounding with a single thought. Now what? A feeling familiar from his school days. Like you'd been pretending to study the lesson, and now suddenly you had to answer for it. Cold sweat ran down his forehead. He walked out of his office. The secretary watched him go with wide, rounded eyes. She started to say something after him, but he just tossed back that he'd be in touch later and practically flew out of the office. Of course, she immediately ran over to the cabinet. She told everyone that the Criminal Investigation Department had called, that Thomas had walked out of his office pale as a sheet and vanished. For several weeks after that, she walked around him with pointed concern. So there he was, sitting in his car, trying to put together at least some kind of plan in his head. That's when the full absurdity of the situation hit him. To grasp its scale, one detail is enough. In his own car, the passenger seat was permanently buried under stuff. If he wanted to give someone a ride, he needed about 10 minutes just to clear away all that junk before the person could even sit down. And this same man was about to go decontaminate a crime scene, where the conversation was about biological evidence, disinfection, professional cleanliness, and according to his own plan, it sounded bold. But in reality, he didn't know a single thing. An image surfaced in his memory from a TV show. The specialists there always showed up in white protective coveralls, so the first task was to swing by the hardware store and buy a suit like that. Sitting behind the wheel, he searched for a way out of a situation that looked absolutely hopeless. And he did what many people do in moments like that. He called his mom. He explained that he was now sort of a cleaner for places like that, that he'd already been called to his first job, and he asked her what supplies he should bring. The mother blurted out without hesitation, "Thomas, can I come with you?" He couldn't refuse. He stopped by a hardware store, bought 2 protective coveralls, and headed to his mother's. She was already waiting outside the house, with 2 buckets in her hands. The logic was ironclad. Any cleanup requires buckets. They went together, and to this day, the family they ended up with still has no idea that this was the very first call of the newly minted specialist. Everything went extremely professionally and tactfully. Thomas expressed his condolences and clarified exactly where the worksite was located. He didn't introduce his mother as his mother. Burke introduced her as a colleague who was assisting him on the job that day. It sounded solid and raised no questions from the clients. And then something happened that he wasn't at all prepared for. It was essentially his mother doing the cleaning, because he stood beside her in a kind of stupor, as if rooted to the floor. They scrubbed away the evidence with sponges, rags, and brushes. His mother had brought them with her. The moment the work was finished and the tools were packed up, he gave himself a firm promise: never again. But something inside had already latched on for good.